Buenos días.
Good morning. We're going to start this session about the trends in the oil sector in Latin America, the non-conventional and the offshore. For this session, I will be the chair. My name is Edmar. I'm a professor in the University of Rio, and I work at the energy group. This session has two speakers. The first speaker, who will be talking about the trends of the oil sector, particularly the non-conventional offshore issues, Queiroz, and he's also a professor of the Institute of Economy and a member of the Group of Energy of Economics of Energy of the University of Rio, and he is now a candidate for a title at the university for the National Agency of Oil. He has been for 4 years the director, or one of the directors, at the National Agency of Petroleum, the agency which coordinates the policies about petroleum in Brazil, the one which implements the tender policies, and he plays a very important role in the petroleum sector in Brazil. And he will give us a presentation about the trends of this sector in Latin America. Then Agustín Castaño will be speaking to us. He is a senior consultant in our region. He works with gas and petroleum. He has a long experience in consulting. He has been a partner in Busal in consulting, and he has the opportunity to participate in many reform and restructuring processes for the institution, for the industry of gas and petroleum in our region, and we invited him so that he can give us a perspective more focused on long-term in terms of petroleum in our region and the state companies. Agustín currently is a partner of a consulting firm called Prisma in Brazil, and he also does research in Brazil. This plenary session is very important because the petroleum sector is going through a big transition in our region, and this transition is related to changes in the base of the resources, which means the production potential have changed completely. When we talk about the non-conventional in North America and the perspective that this new frontier, geological frontier, should be something that we take advantage of in our region. And also in terms of offshore, the discovery of the pre-salt in Brazil, have changed radically the potential in the region. It has a big exploitation project, and all of these new potentials are very important. Also, the institutional aspect in a region is going through a huge change, and there have been a lot of changes in many countries. For example, in Mexico, the most important is where there are the most changes, but also in Brazil, we're going through a lot of changes. Also, some countries are talking about institutional changes, and the role of the state companies is changing. There are many changes about the corporate governance, and Agustín will be telling us about that. And finally, a change which is not specific to a region, It's a global change, which is the oil prices. And this is changing all the trends in the sector. So Elder and Agustín are here to tell us about that. So here is Elder Queiroz with you. Good morning, and thank you, Adi and the President, Mariam, for inviting me to participate in this event. She has told, as they told me, I am a member of a group who has always been involved in the initiatives of ALED, and now I am finishing my role as director of the Petroleum Agency, but I will keep working with this topic, working for the Academy and integrating the group of economics. My presentation is divided into two big blocks. The first one will be about the changes in the variables of the industry. The price variable is the most important one. You all know about the drop in the oil prices, and I'd like to take some time to talk about the consequences and the impacts or potential impact of these changes. And then I will be analyzing the way in Latin America the development of new frontiers of hydrocarbons is happening, and how it is related directly with the deep water challenges and non-conventional challenges. I'm calling these non-conventional resources or reserve resources and the deep water resources, some of the most important production frontiers that we are seeing in the past couple of years. And I think it's worth analyzing the similarities and differences between these two frontiers for the development and production of hydrocarbons in our countries. So first of all, I will obviously show you a graph with the price drop, but it's important for me to highlight something that's very important, which is a few years ago, the cost to rent a perforation probe in the international industry around 2000, 2003, before the Iraq war, it was $70,000 per day. In the past years, after the prices increased, after 2008 specifically, many companies rented very happily for $1 million per day. Of course, that wasn't the price, the average price, but many companies rented for $1 million per day. And why is this important? As a beginning to our conversation, the relative increase in prices for exploration when the prices increased reflects the decisions to increment investment by the oil companies to look for new resources. And that happened in a moment where the para-oil companies or industry had a maximum or almost maximum capacity. So the issue about the increase, more than proportional increase of renting these perforation tools, just to give this example, was very impacting for the whole industry. Now with the price drops, it will take longer to go back to that place, but I think the important trend is what will be the behavior of the services prices for the para-oil companies, because I believe it will be impossible to keep that level, that very high level of prices for services for oil companies in a scenario where prices are decreasing very rapidly. So oil companies today are reviewing their investment plans, and we are now seeing an excess supply of perforation probes, for example. And that will make those prices to go down. But right now, the relative price in the cost structure, the weight of the equipment and services out of the total of cost is very high, because the crude oil price is dropping, but the services prices are dropping in a slower manner. But with time, I don't know how long, but it's important for us to see these changes in the conditions that are related to the industry of petroleum and gas. The second point I want to make, and Gerardo was talking about earlier, is the need to strengthen the integration between the countries in Latin America. When I mentioned that topic, there are many people imagining an energy integration with the reference matrix, with the European matrix, and I think in our countries we have to look for something which is different, something that's an integration which incorporates the commerce, the bilateral projects and unilateral projects, and other different mechanisms to drive the integration of energy. What's happening here, especially for countries which depend on the development of hydrocarbons, the price drop becomes a macroeconomical issue very fastly. In all countries, in Latin America, Venezuela, Colombia, Brazil, Argentina, etc., but mainly those which export crude oil, the price drops translates into macroeconomical impacts which are very immediate, and that impacts the investment level in relationship with the GDP in those countries. So that transition time where companies review their business plans, so from the macroeconomical point of view there are new decisions going on, but we are also seeing now a macroeconomical impact as well, and that's where we see the issue, that macroeconomical context, which will be more difficult in the next few years, and it transforms into new obstacles for integration, energy and integration objectives. But also, when we do a parallel with the inaugural plenary session today, it's important to match the goals for the policies for each country with the structures and the proper incentives for private investments. We were talking about being attractive in a more difficult context. We can expect that the competition for technological, financial, and investment resources among our different countries will increase as well, and so the institutional regulatory designs will contribute a lot to be able to guarantee an environment, an investment environment for those public or private companies. And I believe Agustín will talk more about this in terms of the decisions that the companies are making, but we can expect an increase in competition for resources at the different companies in our countries. And so the regulatory institutional design is very important in this scenario, and it will impose a series of adaptations and consequences in all those changes. So like I promised, as we all know, prices dropped in a spectacular manner since November of 2014. And what's important here to evaluate, and I think there are many graduate students here, there's an issue about international commerce, which is very important right now for the industry. I believe the commercial strategies by the oil companies have never been as important as they are today. Right now, our decision at our institution, one of the main or key things in terms of the price drops is the difficulty to guarantee market share. So the role by swing producer, which it played by Saudi Arabia, is compromised now because we are perceiving that if we reduce production, in order to go back to the other production level, where could we sell that oil, since in the past 10 or 15 years, the number of producers has increased, and also they have very different cost structures, but importers pay international prices with discounts here and there, so the commercial strategies became more complicated because of the market conditions. So that impacts both demand and also the investment decisions. The same thing is happening in terms of gas, with the big new element that I think you can see it here. I see that we have the three prices. First, this was we saw in Japan. Then it was BP in Europe, and the third one is in Israel. For many years, 10 years ago, the conference's topic was talking about the possibility to converge the gas prices, and then the prices differentiated in a very important way. And what we have now, and that's why I have the graph is like this, 2014, but that year, or this year, we can see this didn't used to look like this for many years, but the prices in Asia are under the European prices. So last week, Genel in Japan was 687, and if we compare with the prices applied 1 year ago, 16, 17, 15, so there's an important relative change, which is going to drive a new dynamics in the regional markets for sure. What's happening in Latin America? It's the production, the oil production of the region. If we look at the region of the most important producer countries, it's growing at not a very significant rate, of around 1% per year, but the consumption of oil derivatives is growing approximately 3 times faster, 2.8%. With gas, the situation is different. Both production and consumption of gas are growing at the most important pace, and this is not about the non-conventional issue yet, but the gas production in our continent is becoming very important, more than importing gas in our area. Not only because of the share by Argentina as an importer of gas, of natural gas, but also the imports by Brazil and that in a perspective, in a context of low prices and the uncertainty about the evolution of the exploration cost, there are important changes in the strategies by the companies in order to keep their investment plans all over the world. For example, like I said in the beginning, there's an ongoing revision of all the business plans. How long it will take, I don't know, but it's not very ambitious to expect an important reduction with the first announcements that we're seeing here on the press, that the big oil companies are promoting important reduction in their global business plans, even in Latin America. So that's the bad news in terms of evolution of investment. But we're going to talk about some positive aspects, because I think in our region there are possibilities, big possibilities, to continue and to broaden the participation by the industry, gas and petroleum, as an important vector of development in our economies. So the question that arises is, what does that new context impact is doing? What does it look like? Is it going to impact, and how what can we expect? We're going to look at the past couple of years so that I can keep up with the title of this panel. We're going to talk about the non-conventional and deep water perspectives for the region, mainly in Brazil. During the past couple of years, we perceive an important activity in terms of offers and exploration opportunities for private and state companies in different countries. So we take the case of Bolivia in 2012. They talk about 15 blocks, 3 companies are participating, 6 blocks were assigned for research and 2 for service contracts. In Ecuador, in the southeast, 4 blocks, 5 companies with service contracts and an exploration phase up to 6 years and 20 years of production. And I'm not going to mention each one of them, but what we can see here is in different countries there are exploration opportunities that were accepted and explored, and many of them are beginning to work on their exploratory programs, and that's very important. I am sorry if my Portuñol is bad, but one translator told me once this. I asked if it was a French-Spanish company conference in Mexico, and just like many other ones here, and I asked if I should speak in French or in Portuñol. And the translator looked at me and said, "Sir, let's do French, because your Portuñol, it's the only individual country that exists in this planet. Each person has their own Portuñol, so we cannot consider that a language." So I apologize, but let's move on. Anyway, in Guatemala and also in Uruguay, in 2012. All the offshore, or the continuation of what we call the Pelotas Cuenca in Brazil, it has a very similar geological structure compared to Uruguay. There were a lot of important companies working on it. In Colombia, in 2014, the NIH, which is the regulatory agency for hydrocarbons, offered 21 onshore blocks and 5 offshore blocks for conventional opportunities. 1 offshore block for non-conventional. 19 companies offered, so we can see a big interest in exploratory activities in Colombia. Mexico has promoted a big change, constitutional and institutional and legal reform, trying to get new investment for oil industry activities is also preparing its different rounds, and many companies are interested, mainly because of the Gulf of Mexico situation, which is very similar to Latin America. And from the geological point of view, as for Peru, they are getting ready for 7 offshore blocks in Suriname, 3 offshore blocks, and 2 onshore blocks. And so all those opportunities show that from the geological activity point of view, there's a big interest by the companies, but it's clear that the price drop conditions, like I mentioned earlier, are impacting the decision-making processes. But from the geological point of view, there's a big activity, and so the institutional conditions will play a very important role from now on, even more important than before, to attract investment. In Brazil, the rounds that were interrupted since 2008 and 2013, the Petroleum Agency did 3 rounds, round 11, with different opportunities offshore and offshore. Also the round 2, it was specific for gas opportunities onshore. And the first round, both of them under the concession regime, and then the pre-sal round under the concept of shared round. So there was a big attraction, especially during the 12th, and the pre-sal contract was also very important because it was the first one. And now there's a proposal called Libra, which is being prospected by a winning consortium, which was Petrobras, Shell, Total, 2 Chinese companies. And it's expected to see an exploratory activity that's important, with an expected success that in the first year should be confirmed. And if the cost structure is more expensive compared to other opportunities, and I will talk about that later. For the second semester, we are confirming. We've seen some notes on the press about the 13th round with opportunities that are similar to the 12th round, offshore and also onshore, for more mature opportunities. And we are analyzing a group of blocks. We already have all the blocks that could be tendered by during the final phase. Maybe within a month we'll see an announcement about the results of the round. So in terms of comparison of these new hydrocarbon frontiers, I wanted to mention what I call the three key factors for the new hydrocarbon frontiers: conventional and non-conventional, deep sea, offshore, and pre-sal. These factors are combined and they show in different ways when we speak about non-conventional and when we speak about deep offshore. So first of all, as an economist before this experience at the agency, I obviously was aware about the importance of the geological knowledge, but I think I underestimated this point, since it's very, very important to have a database and an information database with geological data in order to have an idea of what the conditions are in Brazil compared with other countries. For example, in the United States, there was reported 5 million wells. In Brazil, we have 29,000. For non-conventional, the United States is over 1,000, way over. And compared with Brazil, we can perceive that the knowledge and definition capacity of the geological models is very important. The second point is the type of contracts. Third is the legal regime. Fourth, technology, obviously. Fifth, the group of externalities when we talk about environmental regulation, social impact, local impact. Six is logistics. Seventh is the investment capacity by the companies. Eight is the cost structure. Nine is the cost productivity, and 10 the price trends. So I have 5 more minutes before I finish, so I'm going to skip a couple of things. When we combine these factors between the non-conventional and the deep water opportunities, we see that in the case of Brazil, the non-conventional are one step behind if we compare them with the deep waters, and I'll explain to you why. In the case of pre-sal, evidently the investment needs are very high, very, very high, because obviously we are talking about opportunities which can reach 7,000 meters deep and 300 kilometers away from the shore. There's logistics of reach and helicopters and all of that, and that's why the cost structure for these sites is very expensive, and there's a series of very important aspects in terms of how equipment and materials are managed to guarantee that the safety conditions and the environmental issues are following the best practices. That pre-sal, when we talk about pre-sal, people think it's something in the future, but pre-sal is already in the present. When we consider the main fields, the productivity for each of these sites is much higher than the one that was expected before, and so notoriously in this field called Lula, there are sites with 33,000, 34,000, etc. So the average production is very high and much higher than what was expected. The Lula field is an area originally was called Tupi, and it was added to the second tender round in 2000. That's why we should never forget that the investment cycle is very long. So now it's that we're seeing a production, an important production, but it took over a decade to complete the whole investment cycle and to reach that productivity curve and average growth. And that's very important with the 43 wells by Brazil. If Brazil was a country, today it would be number 4th in Latin America. Here we have for Brazil two sides some data that by the Brazil review, and we compare it with other data by BP Statistics Review. So we see Brazil in average is at 670 barrels. So in terms of money, it already reached the level of 700 per day. And we noticed that it started perforation activities in 2007. And so it's important to notice that within 7 or 8 years, it reached a very important production level. And that's why it's already a reality, a very significant one. As for the non-conventional in the case of Latin America, in the majority of the countries of the world, the big intention is to replicate the American success. But like I said earlier, the level of geological knowledge in the United States cannot be compared with the one at any other country. I think in Argentina, because of the experience, because of the Elquina Cuenca, there are possibilities, faster possibilities, but in Brazil, even with the 12th round, which offered onshore areas for gas, we still don't expect to see short-term or mid-term important results because, like I said earlier, that has to do with the cycle times. These cycles are very prolonged, very long. So we are we're still very far from the North American situation, but this doesn't mean I'm just talking about the need to stop. Actually, it's the opposite. We need to accelerate the studies to develop, but we cannot try to talk about these developments and expect fast results. It's important to talk about this, the needs, the business models, the technological needs, but in this case, it's a different case because the production scales are very different. In the case of Brazil, for example, the NP has very high requirements to qualify and to score these companies that can participate as operators level A. In the case of non-conventional, there are broader possibilities for different types of companies to participate. So, yellow card and then red card, and I think I have to stop. I'm about to finish. So like I said, the tendency, the low price tendency can allow for some type of projects, and what's the impact of these low prices in terms of investment decisions. From the demand point of view, when prices fall, that's good, but from the point of view of development of new projects, since we have different types of companies, it wouldn't be surprising to see that some of them will not be able to develop resources with the cost level that is more elevated in comparison with the price situation that we're seeing. So the conclusions, the reference, with the new prices of oil, it translates into microeconomical impacts. I tried to show with the revision of investment plans and also macroeconomical impacts, the reduction of exports, strong cuts in budgets by the government, the new hydrocarbon frontiers. They drive the inter-energy competition, and once again we see the importance of reviewing the challenges by the national policies in comparison with the international perspectives. So I'm available for answers after this session, and I apologize for taking more time than I should have. Thank you. Thank you, Elder. Let's ask questions after the second presentation. That way we'll have the opportunity to speak with the two of them. So Agustín will be giving us his presentation immediately. Good morning, and thank you for the organizers for this invitation. It's an honor to me to... Those of you who know me, you know that my background is mainly consultant, strategies, with many years of experience, but after all these years, returning to the academic activities is something that makes me very proud to be invited here. I will complement what Elder mentioned in a more general way. I'm going to tell you from the Latin American state companies approach. I've been attracted to this topic for a long time in terms of the different and similar strategies by the companies. I want to talk about a little bit about each one of them and their history, and then get to some conclusions as to how the new challenges that companies are facing, how are they going to police. So instead of talking about just the challenges, but go a little back far and explain how this has happened. So state companies in Latin America, we can think about their origin, their evolution, and their perspectives, and speculate a little bit for this third element. Before that, in order to interpret the different steps of the evolution of one of these companies, we have to keep in mind that the factors that impact them are multiple. Some of them come from the context, and Elder spoke about it a little bit, but in the context there's a lot of factors. For example, the macroeconomical situation in the country, the situation of the state, which changes, and also the geological potential, which changes too, the international prices, the production, the reserves, the exploitation regime, which can be adapted, and also the quality of the resources and the competition. Also, from the company's point of view, there are aspects about that change: the social object, the governance, which can change, the autonomy level, which can change too, the strategic objectives, which can be adapted, the technological and financial capacities, which are a critical element when it's time to make decisions, and also the regulatory function. The cases where the state companies in Latin America subsume the regulatory function until at some point they were separated, and the state company took over the operational role or associative role, and then some specific agency took over the regulatory. So this is a panorama which is not meant to alarm anybody. It's just to say that a priori all of this needs to be taken into account. But what happens is after a few years, 30 in my case, one is in the condition to try to identify the main ones. Let's talk about the origin a little bit. When we talk about the origin, we can observe the characteristics. Some of the companies were originated by the expropriation of existing significant assets, Pemex, Petroperú, PDVSA, for example, in different dates, as we're going to see, but always it was something that had to do with taking control of existing assets. Some others were just launch or relaunches of the activities in the country, the PDF, Petrobras, and APE, Chile. Some other ones had as a main foundation the refining of imported supplies, and the other one, and it's paradoxic in this country, the only institutional case where when there was a concession regime, when we reverted those concessions for the state created a state company without confiscating anything, without canceling any contracts, respecting each of the contracts, and that was Ecopetrol. Ecopetrol, as we're going to see, was founded in 1951, and it came from the reversion of the first wave of concessions that had started in 2001. So it's a unique case in Latin America. It's the one that is created under the most orthodox circumstances. The initial creation date is interesting. I know several of you are familiar with this. Maybe you have not seen it as a whole. You have just seen it isolated. But between the first and the last creation of state companies, there's 60 years of difference. And PDVSA, one of the pioneers in the production of oil, was founded in 1966. Well, Argentina created theirs in 1922. When APF was created, it was the only state company that was integrated in the world in the exploitation of hydrocarbons. We still didn't have the Middle East discoveries, the United States, which was the Mecca, everything was private, etc. So it's interesting to see how some things in Latin America were pioneers in some aspects. Some of the companies changed names along the way, but that doesn't mean much. And we have almost 60 years between all of them, with all the characteristics that I mentioned earlier. As for the evolution, things are not that simple. How does a state company develop? It doesn't get developed in terms of a strategic plan to 5 years with very well-defined steps and strategies. It evolves based on impulses. It evolves in terms that something has happened. Something happened where? In the context that we proposed in the beginning, maybe some internal issue in the company, but mainly it's the context. When something happens in that context, we see the discontinuity in the application context, and immediately what happens is a discussion about the possible adaptation of the regime. So depending on the country, that discussion can be public, open, in forums with public audiences, or it can be overdone by a group of people who define how things are going to be and then announce them the next day, and then we just find out that the structure of the company has changed, and eventually the exploitation regime. We find all types of examples in Latin America. Then those changes are implemented, and they can be incremental or radical, depending on how they align with the objectives of the current administration. For example, Colombia. Colombia changed the regime twice. In 1921, they started the concession with the state company, and I'm sure all of you remember. Then it was reverted, and Ecopetrol was founded. For many years, Ecopetrol was adding reversions, and those reversions were added in terms of business units, very different among themselves, with many organizational problems, until at some point Ecopetrol, later years, they decided to reorganize around 2003, when it took a state of competitive business. In 1974, the Colombian government, along with several institutions, decided to go from concession to association. There are reasons for this, but what it does, it respects some prevalent decisions. It doesn't cancel the concession. It keeps those concessions. And the association regime in 1974, we know there were a lot of success in terms of coverage, in terms of gas and petroleum, but eventually it was considered that by 2003 it has dwindled, and the government adopted a concession wave, a modern type of concession round. But what it did is it respected all the other associations, and therefore, and actually today, the gross production of petroleum in Colombia still comes from concessions, not exploration. Exploration is by concession, but production is still, to a large scale, the product of the big operations done during the association period. The Brazil case is a very valid case. When Brazil found the pre-sal, it continues with the concession. They didn't revert, but they just said that for these strategic fundamental fields such as pre-sal, we add the shared production as an additional regime. Some Brazilian analysts criticize me about this because they say it should be 3 regimes because the government has done the shared succession, which is a direct way to adjudicate Petrobras. But I think this is a very particular case. It doesn't deserve to be recognized as a 3rd regime. I think the Brazilian regime is a mix of 2 regimes. And we have to talk about Mexico finally. It's the biggest current reform because of the different technological and financial challenges in other aspects without monopoly. In the case of Mexico, when the executive office, when they got to Congress, the constitutional change and institutional change, they took this as an example and they called it shared utility. It's a very diffused regime in Colombia. They said it was from Bolivia, which is not true, and the Congress improved the proposal, and at this point Mexico is authorized to use licenses, share production, share utilities, or contracts of services with share characteristics, but they cannot use concession. It is prohibited by the Constitution. So that's why they use this license. That's why they use this license, which is a way to give a concession without really giving it. And now these are just examples. We will talk about Mexico a little bit later. What I'm interested in, to have a good idea, I want to try to identify and to analyze this evolution and get to some conclusions. So out of the factors that I presented earlier, I identified 5 which for me have a big impact in the changes that are produced in the position of the Latin American state companies. First is the state's vocation. It materializes in terms of degree of participation in the economy. Then is the geological protection, which is the exploratory risk. Each circumstance in the country declines a conventional field which is the Cantarell of Mexico. So where is Mexico going? And there are many of them which are complicated. So the geological potential and the exploratory risk increased. The geological potential is dynamic. It's dynamic. The fact that geology is physically there doesn't mean that our reading of that potential is static, or lecture or reading is potential. Of course, international prices we know that is far from what it used to be before. The prices are very volatile. The production and reserves of the country, these are obviously elements of big political pressure. So if the trend is declining, there will be an adjustment done to see what we have to do. And finally, the only element that comes from the right-hand side, from the characteristics of the company, is the technological and financial characteristics of the company, because the lack of them or the excess of them can trigger a big change. So with this, we have built a framework which obviously I hope there will be big waves or colleagues and students who will be perfecting this to understand the evolution of these companies. So we have identified the state in the economy, the exploratory risk, the technological and financial capacities, the international level of prices, and the reserves and production levels as triggers for changes in the exploitation regime and the role of the state companies. The exploitation regime and the role of the state company usually change as a response to something instead of a strategy. They change because something just happened, and not just 10 years ago, just very recently. So the response is very fast. If it's institutional, it will have all of the typical processes of democracy, and it will take time. But if it's more of an authoritarian issue, it could happen overnight. Let's see some examples, and with that we will analyze what has happened with Latin America's companies. So let's think about Venezuela in 1976, the last important company founded. Then Petropar came, but with all due respect, I think there's an important difference in relative weight. So let's talk about Venezuela. Venezuela took a long time. It took a long time. Why? Because the state already participated in the exploitations through the 50-50 associations in a direct way with the private companies, but there was a time where there was a tendency to say, let's not renew concessions, or petroleum should not be done by concessions. So that's how companies started investing, because they saw they didn't have a chance to stay in the business, so that accelerated the whole process. And in 1975, 1976, all assets were confiscated, and Venezuela was founded. And thus the state in the economy that prevailed in a good measure, but I don't know if you can see it here. This is the main driver. This is the second driver. I just wanted to point it. The price international level that causes the 1973 situation, it's a critical element to take ownership. There's an asymmetry situation here. When prices go up, the government becomes nervous to take ownership of most of what is collected, and the control as well. But when the price drops, the government doesn't know what to do, because if they want to participate or to take account into what it owns, it will hit them bad, because they purchase at a high price and are selling cheap. So there's an asymmetric situation towards the increase or reduction of oil. So when there's a drop, they have doubts. When there's an increase, they get anxious. So in 1996 in Venezuela, they started what was called the first wave, the end of the wave of expropriation. It was the late expropriation. However, there's a step that was taken 10 years after that, which is the Venezuelan petroleum opening, and this was done by the tough management. This was not the government. The government had no interest whatsoever. It was PDVSA tough management